It was just past midnight when I realized I had no idea where I was. The GPS on my phone had died, the little battery icon blinking red before the screen went black. The streets around me were narrow, wet from the evening rain, and faintly lit by the yellow glow of streetlights that seemed too far apart. I had been driving for hours, following directions that no longer made sense, and now I was hopelessly lost. My tires hissed against the slick asphalt as I came to a stop, taking a shaky breath, listening to the faint patter of rain on my windshield. Everything felt quiet, too quiet, and I could feel my pulse in the hollow of my chest. I saw a man walking along the sidewalk ahead, his coat soaked through, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't look up as I slowed to a stop beside him. "Excuse me," I called, my voice louder than I intended. "Could you tell me how to get back to the highway?" He paused, just for a moment, and turned his head slightly, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. Then he pointed down the street, towards a curve I hadn't noticed before. "That way," he said, quietly, as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. I nodded and thanked him, even though something about the gesture felt wrong, like a warning. I followed the direction he had pointed, turning onto a street that seemed familiar in shape but unfamiliar in every other way. The rain had slowed, but the fog creeping along the road made it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. Then I noticed the first strange thing, a street sign, simple and green, that had been there when I passed it the first time, was now pointing in a different direction. I frowned, convinced I was imagining it. I pulled over and stared at it. The name was the same, but the arrow pointed left, instead of right. My stomach sank. I checked my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man from before, but there was only the empty street behind me, wet and silent. I kept driving, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the signs had been moved, maybe I had turned onto the wrong street earlier. But the more I drove, the more I noticed changes. Every sign I passed seemed to rotate when I blinked, or shift slightly when I looked away. The street names I knew I had memorized twisted into names I didn't recognize. I began to feel a tight knot in my chest, a rising panic I couldn't shake. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion, that I was imagining things after hours of driving through the rain. But a part of me knew it wasn't imagination. At one intersection, I stopped completely. There were 3 signs, all for streets I thought I knew. But as I watched, slowly, deliberately, each arrow twisted, first a little, then more, until they pointed somewhere completely different, somewhere I had never been. I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The streetlights flickered, briefly plunging me into darkness, and I could hear my own breathing, loud and uneven, in the confined space of the car. I wanted to drive backward, to retrace my steps, but every turn I tried seemed to loop me back here, to this same intersection, the same twisting signs. The streets themselves began to feel wrong. The pavement shimmered under the lights, reflecting shapes that weren't there. Buildings I had passed moments before were now on the opposite side of the street. Doors that had been closed were now open, dark and inviting in a way that made my skin crawl. I drove slowly, trying to remember any landmark, any clue that would confirm I was moving in the right direction. But the city had changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly, and I couldn't trust my eyes. Every corner I turned, every block I passed, felt like stepping into a mirror I didn't recognize. I stopped at a small convenience store, hoping to ask for help, to find someone awake. The fluorescent lights flickered, buzzing softly. Inside, the aisles were stocked as usual, but the shelves seemed oddly arranged, with items I knew should have been on one side now on the other. The cashier, a young woman, looked up at me blankly. I asked for directions, my voice low and urgent, but she just pointed behind me, past the exit door. "Go that way," she said. I glanced over my shoulder, and the street outside seemed different. The rain was heavier now, and the streetlights were dimmer, shadows pooling unnaturally along the curb. I shook my head and got back into my car, hoping she hadn't noticed my hesitation. The air grew colder as I drove, and I realized I was shivering despite my coat. Every time I looked at a sign, I felt my stomach tighten. I could swear I had driven this stretch before, and yet it led to nowhere familiar. The buildings were all closed now, their windows dark and reflecting my own pale face back at me. I began to talk to myself, whispering directions aloud as if speaking might anchor me. Left, no, right, no, back. Each command felt meaningless, like I was speaking into a void that stretched endlessly in all directions. After what felt like hours, I noticed something else. The streets had begun to narrow, walls of buildings pressing closer together, trapping me in a corridor I didn't remember. The street signs now seemed almost alive, twisting slowly, deliberately, as if they were watching me, guiding me somewhere I didn't want to go. I tried to drive faster, but the car responded sluggishly, like it too was resisting, like the city itself was against me. My heart was racing. I wanted to stop, to leave the car and run, but the air outside smelled of wet concrete and something metallic that made my stomach turn. I finally came to a small square, completely empty except for a single lamppost in the center. I parked, trying to calm myself. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick and heavy. I got out of the car and looked around, hoping to find a street I recognized, any sign that might lead me home. That's when I saw it. The signs around the square, each one for streets I had driven, were now pointing directly at me, their arrows sweeping slowly in my direction as though the city wanted me to stay. I stepped back instinctively, heart hammering, and the lamppost flickered, casting long, moving shadows that stretched like fingers across the wet cobblestones. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, but the silence was unbearable. Not the absence of sound, exactly, but a silence that felt thick, heavy, as though the world had paused to watch me. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. Every instinct told me to run, to drive, to move, but I couldn't trust where I was going. The signs continued to shift when I looked away, and even when I tried to focus, they seemed to resist my gaze, twisting subtly as though alive. Eventually, I got back in the car. I didn't care about the directions anymore. I just drove, hoping that eventually the city would end, that I would find a highway or a familiar street, anything. But no matter how far I drove, no matter which turn I took, the signs kept moving, slowly, deliberately. I began to notice other things too. The windows of buildings reflected not just my car, but fleeting shadows of figures that weren't there. I thought I heard footsteps behind me once, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror, there was nothing. Only my own terrified eyes staring back. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning anymore. The city felt endless, a maze designed for me alone. Occasionally, a streetlight would flicker and reveal a figure in the distance, just beyond the reach of the glow. Each time, I would slow down, squint, and then find the street empty, as though the world itself had swallowed whatever I had glimpsed. My phone remained dead. My fuel was low, and yet I couldn't stop, couldn't rest, couldn't let my mind slip into sleep. Something about the twisting signs made me feel like stopping meant disappearing entirely. Finally, I reached a bridge that spanned a river I didn't recognize. The water below reflected the empty city, the streetlights, the wet asphalt, but something was off. The reflection wasn't quite right, buildings twisted, the lampposts bent slightly, and in the water, I thought I saw the man from earlier, standing under the rain, staring up at me with that same unreadable expression. I blinked, and he was gone. The signs on the bridge pointed straight ahead, but straight ahead was nothing I knew, nothing I remembered. Only more streets, more wet asphalt, more quiet that pressed in on me. I haven't stopped driving since. I don't know how long it's been. Every sign I pass twists when I look away. Every corner I turn brings me somewhere new, somewhere wrong. Sometimes, when I glance in the mirrors, I think I see streets I recognize, only to look again and find they never existed. I have no idea where I am, and I have no idea if leaving is even possible. The city seems alive, patient, and indifferent, guiding me endlessly in a maze I cannot escape. I talk to myself now, just to hear a human voice, but it feels hollow. And sometimes, when I pause for a moment, when the car idles in the wet, dim light, I see the street signs, turning. Slowly, deliberately. Turning just for me. It was a little after 11 p.m. when I first saw her. The rain had just started, not heavy enough to be loud, but steady enough to blur the streetlights into soft halos. I was driving home from a late shift, exhausted in that hollow way where your thoughts feel slow and heavy. The road was familiar, a long stretch I had driven hundreds of times, lined with closed shops and dark apartment buildings. That was why she stood out immediately, even before my mind fully processed what I was seeing, and I felt a quiet tension settle in my chest. She was standing in the middle of the road. Not on the sidewalk. Not crossing. Just standing there, perfectly still, right between the lanes. She wore a light-colored coat that looked too thin for the weather, and her dark hair hung straight down, plastered slightly to her face from the rain. My foot hovered over the brake, panic flaring for a split second, but then something strange happened. The car in front of me slowed slightly, and went around her. Cleanly. Smoothly. Like she was a traffic cone or a pothole. I frowned, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. The car behind that one did the same thing. No honking. No sudden stops. No shouting out the window. Just a gentle swerve, a casual adjustment, and then straightening out again. It was as if everyone else had already accepted her presence, like she was part of the road itself. I slowed down, my heart beginning to pound, watching her grow closer through the rain-streaked windshield. She didn't flinch. She didn't look at the cars passing inches from her. She just stood there, facing slightly away, as if waiting for something. When it was my turn, should have done what everyone else did. I knew that. My body knew that. But my mind hesitated. I rolled to a near stop, staring at her. Up close, she looked younger than I first thought. Maybe in her 20s. Her shoes were soaked, water pooling around her feet. Her hands hung at her sides, fingers slightly curled, unmoving. I cracked my window and called out, asking if she was okay, if she needed help. My voice sounded thin and nervous in the rain. She didn't respond. She didn't even turn her head. A car behind me honked, sharp and impatient. The sound made me jump. I glanced in my mirror, then back at her. For a moment, I had the strangest sensation that if I waited too long, something irreversible would happen. I eased the wheel and went around her, my car passing so close I could see raindrops sliding down her coat. As I did, I felt an intense wave of discomfort, like I was breaking an unspoken rule. I looked in my side mirror, expecting to see her behind me. The road was empty. The rest of the drive home felt wrong. The rain seemed heavier, the streets quieter. I kept replaying the image of her standing there, alone and untouched, and the way everyone else had simply accepted it. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were shaking. I stood by my window for a long time, watching the street below, half expecting to see her again. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her silhouette in the rain, unmoving. The next night, she was there again. Same road. Same place. Same posture. This time, I noticed more cars. Traffic was flowing normally, headlights reflecting off wet pavement, and yet every single vehicle curved around her without slowing much. No one rolled down a window. No one stopped. It was as if she existed in a space that demanded acknowledgement but not concern. I felt that same tightness in my chest, heavier now, mixed with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. I didn't stop this time. I couldn't. As I passed her, I glanced sideways. For a split second, I thought she was looking at me. Not directly, just enough that I could see part of her face. Her expression was empty. Not sad. Not angry. Just vacant, like she was barely there at all. The moment passed, and she was gone behind me, swallowed by rain and darkness. I started paying attention after that. Every night, around the same time, she appeared. Always in the middle of the road. Always still. Always ignored. I mentioned it to a coworker once, casually, trying to sound calm. He laughed and said I was probably just tired, that people do stupid things at night. But when I pressed him, asked if he had seen her, his smile faded slightly. He said he didn't drive that way anymore. He wouldn't explain why. The feeling followed me now, even when I wasn't driving. A sense of being watched. Of standing still while the world moved around me. Sometimes, when I stood in line at the store or waited for the elevator, I'd feel disconnected, like I didn't quite belong where I was. I'd catch people glancing past me instead of at me, their eyes sliding away too easily. It made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't put into words. One night, curiosity overcame fear. I parked my car a block away and walked back toward the spot. The rain soaked through my jacket almost immediately. As I approached, I saw her clearly under the streetlight, exactly where she always stood. Cars continued to pass, headlights washing over her without pause. I stayed on the sidewalk, my heart hammering, and called out again. Louder this time. She didn't move. I stepped off the curb. The moment my foot touched the road, an intense pressure filled my chest, like the air had thickened. The sound of traffic dulled, becoming distant and muffled. I took another step, closer to her, and my vision blurred slightly. Panic surged through me. I had the overwhelming sense that if I reached her, I wouldn't be able to leave. That I would stop being noticed. That the world would simply flow around me, endlessly. I backed away, stumbling onto the sidewalk. The pressure lifted instantly. The sounds returned. I looked up, gasping, and she was still there, unchanged. For the first time, she turned her head slightly toward me. Our eyes met. There was no recognition in her gaze. Only a quiet, endless waiting that made my blood run cold. I ran back to my car and drove home without looking back. That night, I dreamed I was standing in the road. Cars passed me on both sides, their drivers staring straight ahead. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When I woke up, my throat hurt, and my room felt unbearably quiet. Now, sometimes when I'm driving, I feel the urge to stop. To stand still. To let everything move around me. And every night, when the rain falls just right and the streetlights glow soft and yellow, I wonder if she ever tried to leave, or if she's still waiting for someone else to take her place. It started on a night when the city felt unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice your own footsteps. It was just after midnight, and a light rain had been falling for hours, turning the pavement dark and reflective. I was walking home because the buses had stopped running, and the streets were nearly empty. The air smelled like wet concrete and rusted metal, and every sound carried farther than it should have, which made me feel exposed in a way I couldn't explain. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the exhaustion settling into my legs. As I walked, I felt a faint vibration beneath my shoes, so subtle I almost ignored it. It wasn't strong enough to shake me, just a gentle pulse, like standing near distant construction. I stopped and lifted one foot, pressing the sole of my shoe down again, trying to figure out if it was coming from the ground or from me, and the sensation lingered in a way that made me uneasy. I told myself it had to be traffic somewhere below, maybe a subway line or underground pipes. The city is full of things you're not meant to notice unless you're paying attention. Still, when I stood perfectly still, I felt it again, a slow, rhythmic movement under the pavement, rising and falling with a steady patience that didn't match any machine I knew. It reminded me of something organic, and that thought made my stomach tighten. I started walking again, faster this time, hoping movement would distract me. The vibration followed. With each step, the ground seemed to respond, not in time with my stride, but on its own quiet rhythm. I glanced around, half expecting to see cracks forming or steam rising from manholes, but everything looked normal. Streetlights buzzed faintly overhead, and rain slid down their poles in thin, silvery lines, and the city pretended nothing was wrong. When I reached an intersection, I paused under a flickering light. The pavement there felt different. The vibration was clearer, more pronounced, like standing on the deck of a ship. I placed my hand on the ground, ignoring how strange that felt, and instantly pulled it back. The concrete was warm. Not sun-warmed, not engine-warmed. Warm in a way that felt deep, as if the heat was coming from below, from somewhere far beneath the surface. My heart began to race, and I stood up quickly, wiping my hand on my jeans. I laughed under my breath, a nervous, forced sound, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Cities are full of heat and movement. Pipes run everywhere. Still, the warmth lingered in my palm, and the vibration continued, steady and patient, like it didn't care whether I understood it or not. As I continued down the street, I noticed I wasn't the only one reacting. A stray dog stood near a trash bin, its ears flattened, body tense. It refused to step onto the sidewalk, pacing back and forth along the edge like it was afraid of crossing an invisible line. When I approached, it backed away, whining softly, eyes fixed on the ground beneath us. That small detail unsettled me more than the vibration itself. The farther I walked, the stronger the sensation became. It was no longer just beneath my feet. I felt it in my legs, faintly in my chest, a slow expansion and contraction that made my breathing feel out of sync. I caught myself unconsciously matching my breath to it, inhaling as the pavement seemed to rise, exhaling as it settled again. When I realized what I was doing, I forced myself to stop, standing there in the rain, heart pounding. I crouched again, pressing my ear close to the ground. At first, there was nothing but the distant hiss of rain and the faint hum of electricity. Then I heard it. A low, muffled sound, so quiet it felt like it might have been inside my head. It wasn't a noise exactly, more like pressure shifting, air moving slowly through something vast and hollow. The sound came in intervals, perfectly timed with the vibration beneath me. I stood up abruptly, a wave of nausea washing over me. The streets suddenly felt too narrow, the buildings too close. I had the overwhelming sense that I was standing on something that was not meant to be disturbed, something old and enormous that existed beneath the city without anyone's awareness. The thought followed me as I hurried forward, my steps uneven, my breath shallow. I tried to distract myself by focusing on familiar landmarks, but even those felt off. The cracks in the pavement seemed deeper than before, dark lines stretching and branching like veins. Puddles rippled without rain touching them, their surfaces trembling in time with the ground. Every rational explanation I reached for felt thin and fragile, unable to fully cover what I was experiencing. At one point, I passed a closed storefront with large glass windows. As I walked by, I caught my reflection, distorted by the rain and darkness. For a moment, it looked like the reflection lagged behind me, rising and falling slightly, as if my image were standing on something soft instead of solid ground. I stopped and stared until the reflection stilled, but the feeling of being out of sync didn't leave. The vibration was strongest near my apartment building. By then, it felt deliberate, almost attentive. Each pulse seemed slower, heavier, like the ground was growing tired. I stood at the entrance, keys in my hand, reluctant to step inside. Part of me felt that whatever was happening belonged to the street, and that leaving it behind wouldn't make it stop. It would just continue, unnoticed, beneath everyone else. Before I went in, I knelt one last time and pressed my palm flat against the pavement. The warmth was undeniable now, and the movement beneath my hand felt unmistakable. It rose gently, then fell away, like a massive chest drawing breath. I pulled my hand back, my skin prickling, my mind screaming to run, but my body remained still for a few seconds longer than it should have. I don't take that route anymore. I avoid walking at night when the city quiets enough for subtle things to be felt. But sometimes, when I lie awake in bed, I swear I can feel it through the floor, faint and distant, a slow rhythm far below. And in those moments, I can't shake the feeling that the pavement isn't just supporting us, but enduring us, breathing patiently while we live our lives above it, unaware of what's waiting underneath. I noticed the footprints just after midnight, when the street outside my apartment was completely dry. The weather had been clear all evening, cool and still, the kind of night where sounds travel farther than they should. I had stepped outside to take the trash down, half asleep, my mind already drifting toward bed. That was when I saw them on the concrete near the curb, dark and glossy, like someone had just walked through a shallow puddle and kept going, and the sight made me pause longer than I meant to. They were barefoot footprints. Perfectly shaped, heel to toe, slightly darker than the surrounding pavement. I stood there holding the trash bag, listening. No dripping water. No rain. No sprinklers. The streetlights reflected off the asphalt evenly, and everything around the footprints was dry. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation, but I couldn't think of one that felt right, and the silence pressed in while I stared. The footprints led away from my building, spaced naturally, not hurried, not slow. Just walking. I looked up and down the street. No one in sight. No open doors. No movement behind windows. The prints looked fresh, their edges still sharp, as if they hadn't had time to fade. A faint chill crept up my spine, and I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. I dropped the trash into the bin and stood there a moment longer than necessary. I could have gone back inside. I should have. But the longer I looked at the footprints, the stronger the urge became to follow them, not out of curiosity exactly, but out of a strange sense of responsibility, like ignoring them would be a mistake I wouldn't be able to undo. That thought unsettled me more than the footprints themselves. I started walking, slowly at first, keeping my distance from the prints as if they might react to me. They continued down the street, turning the corner at the end of the block. The pavement remained dry everywhere else. My footsteps sounded too loud in the quiet, each one echoing slightly, and I found myself stepping carefully, unconsciously trying not to overlap the footprints, which made my path feel deliberate in a way I didn't like. As I rounded the corner, the street narrowed. The footprints stayed centered, never veering toward the sidewalk or the road, as though whoever made them knew exactly where they were going. I glanced back once, expecting to see them fading behind me, but they looked just as dark as when I'd first seen them. The night felt heavier here, the streetlights spaced farther apart, leaving pockets of shadow that seemed deeper than they should have been. I tried to listen for signs of someone ahead of me. Breathing. Footsteps. Anything. There was nothing. The air was still, almost thick, and the faint hum of electricity from the streetlights seemed louder than usual. With every step, I felt a growing unease, a sense that I was walking into something I didn't understand and wouldn't be able to explain if I tried. The footprints led past closed shops and darkened houses, places that looked ordinary during the day but felt distant and unfamiliar at night. I noticed then that the prints never overlapped or smudged. Each one was clean, distinct, like they were appearing rather than being made. That thought stuck with me, settling into my chest and making it hard to breathe normally. After a few blocks, the footprints slowed. The spacing between them shortened slightly, as if the person had hesitated or grown tired. I felt my own pace slow in response, mirroring something I couldn't see. The street grew quieter still, and I became acutely aware of my own presence, the sound of my jacket brushing against itself, the soft scuff of my shoes on dry concrete. They stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. I stood a few feet away, staring at the last set of prints. 2 feet, planted firmly, toes pointed forward. No indication of where they went next. No turn. No trail fading away. Just stopped. I looked around, my heart beating faster now. The nearby buildings loomed close, their windows dark, reflecting only vague shapes and the dull glow of the streetlight behind me. I waited, listening. For a moment, I had the uncomfortable impression that I was the one being followed now, that whatever had made those footprints was standing just out of sight, watching to see what I would do. The feeling was strong enough that I resisted the urge to turn around too quickly, afraid of what I might, or might not, see. When I finally forced myself to move, I stepped closer to the last prints. The concrete beneath them was dry to the touch everywhere except the shape of the feet themselves, which felt cool and slightly damp, as if the moisture didn't belong to the surface. I pulled my hand back immediately, my stomach twisting at the sensation. I laughed quietly, a thin, nervous sound meant to break the tension. It didn't help. The silence swallowed it instantly, and the street felt even more empty afterward. I straightened up and decided, firmly, that I was done. Whatever this was, I didn't need to understand it. I turned around and started back the way I came, trying not to rush, trying not to look like someone who was afraid. I had taken maybe 10 steps when I heard it. A soft, wet sound behind me. Barely audible. Like skin lifting from concrete. I stopped without turning around. My entire body went rigid, every sense sharpening at once. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. Another step. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I became painfully aware of the space behind me, of the darkness just beyond the reach of the streetlight. I told myself not to look. That if I didn't acknowledge it, it might stop. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations, animals, pipes, anything, but none of them matched the rhythm of the sound or the certainty growing in my chest that I was no longer alone. The sound moved closer. I turned around. There was nothing there. Just the sidewalk, dry and empty. But between me and the place where the footprints had stopped, a new set had appeared. Fresh. Dark. Wet. Facing me. I felt a wave of cold wash through my body, starting at my scalp and moving downward. The footprints were closer than before, spaced just far enough apart to suggest slow, careful movement. I took a step back without thinking, and the sound came again, right in front of me this time, as if something had stepped forward to match my movement. I didn't wait anymore. I ran. I didn't look at the ground as I ran. I couldn't. I focused on the distant glow of my building, on the sound of my own breath, ragged and loud. Behind me, the wet sounds followed, unhurried, steady, never speeding up, as if it knew I couldn't outrun it no matter how hard I tried. When I reached my building, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them once. The sound stopped just behind me. I could feel the space there, the presence of something standing too close, patient and silent. I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it as my heart hammered painfully in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. Every small sound made me flinch. When morning finally came, I went outside, telling myself I had imagined everything, that fear had filled in the gaps. The sidewalk was completely dry. No footprints. No marks. Nothing out of place. But sometimes, when I leave late at night, I notice a single wet footprint near my door. And it's always facing inward. She touched the wall without looking at it, like she already knew exactly where it was. It was late, close to 1 in the morning, and the hallway outside my apartment was quiet in that hollow way it only gets after midnight. The overhead lights hummed softly, casting long shadows along the peeling paint and scuffed floor. I had stepped out to take a phone call because the signal was bad inside, and that was when I saw her standing near the stairwell, half-lit, completely still, and already making the space feel smaller. She looked like someone who lived there. That was the first thing I noticed. Not threatening, not out of place. Just a woman in her late 20s maybe, wearing a dark jacket and flat shoes, her hair pulled back loosely like she hadn't given it much thought. She wasn't pacing or fidgeting. She was simply standing there, facing the wall, her head slightly tilted, as if listening for something on the other side. I hesitated, unsure whether to say anything, and the silence stretched thin between us. When she raised her hand and placed her palm against the wall, the sound it made was soft and dull, the kind of noise you'd barely register under normal circumstances. A flat, muted thump. What followed it, though, made my stomach tighten. The sound echoed. Not loudly, but clearly. It traveled down the hallway, bounced back, and lingered in the air longer than it should have, like the building itself was slow to let it go. I frowned, pulling the phone away from my ear. The echo faded eventually, but not naturally. It thinned out in layers, stretching longer than the length of the hall could explain. I told myself it was just acoustics, old buildings do strange things with sound, but the explanation felt weak even as I formed it. She didn't react at all. She kept her hand there, resting against the wall like she was waiting for a response. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud the moment it left my mouth. The words bounced once and settled quickly, the way they were supposed to. That contrast didn't escape me. She turned her head slowly, not toward me exactly, but just enough that I could see part of her face in profile. Her expression was calm, almost distant, like she hadn't expected an answer either way. "Yes," she said after a pause. Her voice was quiet, steady. It didn't echo. She took her hand off the wall and let it fall back to her side. I felt a strange disappointment when she did, like something unfinished had just been interrupted. The hallway returned to its normal stillness, but the air felt thicker now, heavier, as if the sound had left something behind. She glanced down the corridor toward the exit, then back at the wall, as if reconsidering something only she understood. I told myself to go back inside. The call was forgotten. Everything about the moment felt slightly off, and I didn't want to be standing there if it turned into something I couldn't explain. But before I could move, she stepped closer to the wall again. This time, she pressed her fingers against it, lightly at first, then more firmly, like she was testing its surface. The sound came back. Sharper this time. A series of soft taps that echoed unevenly, overlapping themselves, trailing off in a way that made it impossible to tell when one ended and the next began. I felt it in my chest more than my ears, a low vibration that lingered just a second too long. My breathing slowed without me realizing it, syncing with the fading echoes, and when I noticed, I had to force myself to inhale. "That happens sometimes," she said, still not looking at me. "It's worse at night." I asked what she meant, but she didn't answer. She leaned in closer, resting her forehead gently against the wall. The gesture was intimate, almost tender, like she was listening to someone breathing on the other side. I became acutely aware of the building around us, of the layers of concrete and pipes and empty spaces hidden behind the walls. I wondered how thick they really were, and the thought made me uneasy. The hallway lights flickered briefly, just enough to make the shadows jump. When they steadied, she was smiling faintly. Not at me. At the wall. "I didn't notice it at first," she said. "Most people don't." I didn't know what to say. The silence stretched again, but it felt different now, charged, expectant. Somewhere deep in the building, I thought I heard a low hum, like machinery starting up, but it faded before I could be sure. She lifted her hand again and knocked once, firmly. The echo that followed was wrong. It didn't fade. It came back slower, heavier, as if the sound had traveled a great distance before returning. It layered over itself, filling the hallway, pressing in from all sides. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me, my ears ringing slightly as the noise refused to die. My reflection in the stairwell window looked distorted, like the glass was vibrating too. I stepped back without thinking. The echo continued, thinning but never fully disappearing, like a breath being held indefinitely. She finally turned to face me fully, and for the first time, her eyes focused directly on mine. There was something tired in them. Relieved, almost. "See?" she said quietly. "It goes deeper than it should." The sound stopped all at once. The sudden silence was worse. My ears buzzed, and my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. She lowered her hand and stepped away from the wall, the faint smile gone now. For a moment, she looked like she might say something else, but instead she walked past me toward the stairs, her footsteps normal, unremarkable, disappearing downward without echo. I stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the spot where her hand had been. The wall looked the same as it always had. Plain. Solid. I told myself I was just tired, that the late hour had played tricks on my perception. Eventually, I went back inside and locked my door, double-checking it before I let myself sit down. I tried to sleep, but every small noise made me tense. Pipes shifting. Distant doors closing. Sounds I had heard 1,000 times before now felt stretched, delayed, like they were taking longer to reach me. At one point, I pressed my own palm against the wall beside my bed, just to reassure myself. The sound it made echoed. Not loudly. Not obviously. Just long enough that I pulled my hand away and lay there in the dark, listening, wondering how far it had gone, and whether something on the other side was listening back. I didn't notice the smell at first. It was late, close to midnight, and I was cutting through the alley behind my building the way I always did when I didn't feel like walking the longer, brighter route. The alley was narrow and damp, lit by a single flickering light near the dumpsters. The ground was still wet from an earlier rain, and the air carried the usual mix of trash, old brick, and metal. Nothing unusual. Just another quiet night, and that made me lower my guard. Halfway through, I slowed down. Something in the air had changed. It wasn't strong, and it wasn't unpleasant, but it made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. The smell felt familiar before I could identify it, and that familiarity unsettled me more than anything else. I stopped walking and breathed in slowly, trying to place it, trying to remember where I'd smelled it before. It reminded me of dust warmed by sunlight. Of old paper. Of something wooden and dry, like shelves that hadn't been touched in years. It didn't belong in an alley behind an apartment building. The dumpsters were still there, the wet concrete still reflected the light, but the smell cut through it all, soft and persistent, like it had always been there and I was only just noticing. I stood there longer than I meant to. The alley was silent except for a distant hum of traffic somewhere far away. The smell grew stronger the longer I stayed still, not overwhelming, just clearer, more defined. With it came a faint sense of pressure behind my eyes, the kind you get when you're trying to remember something important but can't quite reach it. My heart began to beat a little faster, and I realized I was holding my breath again. I took a step forward. The smell followed. That was when the unease settled in properly. It wasn't drifting through the air like a normal scent. It felt anchored, like it belonged to the space itself. Each step I took deeper into the alley made it stronger, more specific, and with it came fragments of emotion that didn't feel like my own. A sense of quiet. Of waiting. Of time passing slowly in a place where nothing ever really changed. I tried to tell myself it was nostalgia triggered by something random. Smells do that. They pull memories out of nowhere. But this didn't connect to any clear image. It felt older than any memory I could grab, like something from before I knew how to remember properly. That thought made my skin prickle. About 2/3 of the way through the alley, I stopped again. The smell was strongest here. I looked around, expecting to see something that explained it, an open door, a broken crate, anything, but the alley looked exactly the same as it always had. Same brick walls. Same stains. Same overflowing dumpster at the far end. And yet, standing there, I had the overwhelming impression that I had been in this place before under very different circumstances. The feeling wasn't visual. It was emotional. A sense of being small. Of standing still while something tall loomed nearby. I felt a tightness in my throat, a quiet fear that didn't have a clear source. My hands had curled into fists without me realizing it. I forced them to relax, trying to shake off the sudden dread. The smell shifted slightly. It grew warmer. With it came a sudden, sharp wave of recognition that made my stomach drop. Not a memory, exactly. More like the shadow of one. I felt certain, in a deep and uncomfortable way, that this was the smell of a place I had been forced to stay. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere where voices were kept low. Somewhere where time moved differently, measured not by clocks but by routines. I took a step back. The smell didn't fade. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the alley walls. The bricks looked uneven now, their shadows deeper, the mortar lines darker, like they were absorbing the weak light instead of reflecting it. The farther end of the alley seemed longer than it should have been, stretching just a little beyond what I remembered. My pulse thudded in my ears, steady and loud. I told myself to leave. That thought came clearly and urgently. But my feet didn't move right away. A part of me felt reluctant, like leaving meant abandoning something unfinished. The smell wrapped around that feeling, gentle but insistent, like a hand resting between my shoulder blades, not pushing, just guiding. When I finally started walking again, it felt wrong. Each step forward felt heavier, like I was moving against a subtle resistance. The smell stayed with me, clinging to the air around my head, filling my lungs. With every breath, the sense of familiarity deepened, and with it came a growing certainty that whatever this place reminded me of, I hadn't left it willingly. As I walked, faint sounds began to surface at the edges of my awareness. Not distinct enough to identify. Just impressions. The soft scrape of a chair leg. The muted closing of a door. A low voice speaking somewhere nearby, not loud enough to understand, but close enough to feel directed at me. I stopped again, heart racing, straining to listen. The alley was silent. The sounds hadn't come from outside. They had come from inside my head, carried in on the smell like unwanted passengers. I felt suddenly exposed, like the alley was no longer just a place I was walking through, but a place that was noticing me in return. The thought made my breath come faster, shallower. Near the end of the alley, the smell changed one last time. It sharpened, gaining a faint chemical edge that made my nose sting. With it came a sudden image so brief I almost missed it. A white ceiling. Too clean. Too bright. The sense of lying still while someone stood nearby, just out of view. The image vanished instantly, but it left behind a cold weight in my chest. I broke into a quick walk, then stopped myself from running. I didn't want to draw attention, even though there was no one there. The feeling of being watched had settled in fully now, heavy and undeniable. I reached the end of the alley and stepped out onto the street, where the normal smells of the city rushed back in around me. The alley behind me looked unchanged. Ordinary. Empty. But the smell lingered. It clung to my clothes, faint but unmistakable. I could still feel it in the back of my throat, that sense of forgotten familiarity pressing gently against memories I didn't want to examine too closely. I walked home quickly, unlocked my door, and stepped inside, locking it behind me with more force than necessary. Inside, everything smelled normal. Clean. Familiar. I stood there for a long time, breathing slowly, waiting for my heart to calm down. Eventually, the feeling eased, just enough for me to move, to sit down, to convince myself that exhaustion had made me overthink everything. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I caught it again. That same smell. Faint. Warm. Patient. And with it came the quiet certainty that the place it belonged to hadn't been destroyed or left behind at all. It had just been waiting for me to remember it. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was just fatigue. It was late, well past midnight, and I was walking home after a long shift, my mind dulled by routine and lack of sleep. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own movement. Each step echoed softly off the buildings, the sound crisp in the cool night air. I remember thinking how empty everything felt, and how relieved I was to be alone. Then I heard a footstep. It came from directly in front of me. I stopped walking immediately. The sound had been clear, unmistakable, the same hollow tap my shoes made against the pavement. I stood still, heart slowing as I waited for something else to happen. Nothing did. The street remained empty, stretching out ahead of me under dim streetlights. After a few seconds, I laughed quietly at myself and started walking again, telling myself it must have been an echo from somewhere behind me. I took one step forward. The sound came again, a fraction of a second before my foot touched the ground. This time, the sound did not precede me. It matched exactly, happening when it should have. Relief washed over me so fast it made me dizzy. I exhaled and continued walking, telling myself it was over. It wasn't. The next sound came farther ahead, as if the distance between me and the footsteps was growing. I would hear them 2 steps ahead now, then 3. The rhythm stayed mine, the pace identical, but the source felt detached, like it was no longer just an echo. It felt intentional. Like something was moving in anticipation of me, clearing a path. I slowed down, and the footsteps slowed too. I stopped, and after a brief pause, another step sounded ahead. That was when the fear truly settled in. Not sharp panic, but something heavier, colder. The realization that whatever I was hearing was no longer reacting to me. It was leading me. I stood there under the streetlight, my shadow stretching out in front of me, and for a moment I had the strange impression that my shadow was the one walking, and I was only following. I considered turning around. The thought alone made my chest ache. I imagined hearing the footsteps behind me instead, imagined them adjusting instantly, always staying just out of reach. I couldn't decide which direction felt worse. Staying still felt wrong too, like standing in the middle of a sentence that hadn't finished being spoken. I took another step forward. The footsteps ahead sounded closer now. Not louder, just nearer, as if the distance between us was shrinking instead of growing. I felt a wave of dizziness, my sense of balance briefly off. The street ahead looked unchanged, but it felt different, like it was waiting for something specific to happen. I reached an intersection and stopped again. The footsteps continued for 2 more steps and then stopped as well. I stood there, staring ahead, my pulse pounding. The silence that followed was unbearable. It felt stretched, held open unnaturally, like the world was waiting for me to do something wrong. Very slowly, I raised my foot without stepping forward. I heard the sound anyway. This time, it wasn't exactly right. The rhythm was off by just enough to notice. The sound lingered slightly longer than mine ever did, like the foot had pressed down harder, or stayed in contact with the ground too long. My stomach dropped at the implication. I lowered my foot without completing the step. The sound did not repeat. I became aware then of another sensation, subtle but unmistakable. The feeling of being observed from just ahead of me, from the space where the footsteps had been sounding. Not watched with eyes, but tracked, measured. Like something was waiting for me to catch up to it, or to fall behind. I turned around suddenly, my breath catching. The street behind me was empty. But for a brief moment, I thought I heard my footsteps back there too, faint and delayed, as if someone had only just started walking where I had been standing seconds earlier. The sound faded before I could be sure, leaving me alone with my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. I walked the rest of the way home without stopping, ignoring the sounds as best I could. Sometimes they came before me. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they sounded wrong in ways I didn't want to examine. By the time I reached my building, my legs ached and my head felt light, like I had been holding myself together too tightly for too long. Inside, everything was quiet. Normal. Solid. I locked the door and stood there for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling. Eventually, I told myself it was over. That whatever had happened belonged to the night, to exhaustion, to an overactive mind. But now, sometimes, when I'm walking alone, hesitate before taking a step. Because every so often, in the half-second before I move, I hear it again. A footstep. Already taken. And I can't shake the feeling that one day, if I stop long enough, I'll hear all of them continue without me. She looked back just once, but the way she did it made me slow my steps without realizing why. It was early evening, that dim in-between hour when the sky can't decide whether it's done with the day or not. The street was busy enough to feel normal, but quiet enough that small details stood out. I was walking home from the train station, my coat unbuttoned, hands in my pockets, thinking about nothing in particular. That's when I noticed her a few yards ahead of me, walking in the same direction, her pace steady and unhurried, and something about her felt unfinished. She wasn't doing anything unusual. She wore a long dark coat and carried a tote bag slung over one shoulder. Her hair was loose, moving slightly as she walked. I wouldn't have remembered her at all if it weren't for that moment when she reached the corner and stopped. She stood there, one foot slightly forward, as if she had already decided to cross. Then she turned her head and looked back over her shoulder, not quickly, not nervously, but carefully, like she was checking for something specific, and that was when the discomfort settled in. Her eyes didn't search the street. They landed on me. Not sharply. Not accusingly. Just, expectantly. The look wasn't fear or curiosity. It was quieter than that. It felt like a question she wasn't allowed to ask out loud. I slowed to a stop, my foot hovering for a moment before touching the ground, unsure why my body was reacting so strongly to something so small. The traffic light was red. Cars passed in front of us, tires hissing softly on the road. She kept looking at me, waiting. I glanced around, half expecting someone else to be standing behind me, someone she was actually looking for. There wasn't anyone. The sidewalk stretched empty in both directions. When I looked back at her, her expression hadn't changed. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't frowning. Her face was neutral, but there was tension in the way she held herself, like she was paused mid-thought. The silence between us felt longer than it should have, stretched thin by the noise of passing cars. The light changed. She didn't move. People behind me began to slow, adjusting their paths around us. I felt suddenly aware of my own presence, of the space I occupied. My throat felt dry. I nodded once, without really knowing why, a small, automatic gesture meant to break the moment. The instant I did, she turned forward and stepped into the crosswalk, her pace calm again, like nothing strange had happened, and I stood there, unsettled, watching her go. I crossed a few seconds later, keeping my distance. She walked just ahead of me again, the same steady pace, but something had shifted. The street felt quieter now, like the background noise had dropped slightly. I told myself I was overthinking it. People look back all the time. Maybe she thought she recognized me. Maybe she was checking for traffic and happened to meet my eyes. But the explanation didn't sit right. It felt incomplete, like it skipped over something important. At the next intersection, she slowed again. This time, she didn't stop fully. She hesitated, just enough to be noticeable, and then she looked back once more. The same look. The same quiet question. This time, my stomach tightened. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't spoken. I hadn't followed her closely. And yet, it felt like my presence mattered in a way I didn't understand. I didn't nod this time. Her hesitation stretched. The light was green. People crossed around her, weaving past, brushing close to her coat without acknowledging her pause. She stayed where she was, her gaze fixed on me, waiting. The sense of pressure built in my chest, subtle but insistent, like the moment before you make a decision you can't take back. My pulse quickened. I wanted to look away, to break eye contact, but something held me there. Finally, I shook my head, just slightly. Her shoulders sagged. It was a small movement, but I saw it clearly. She turned forward and crossed anyway, slower now, like the act required more effort than before. I stood there longer than I should have, letting the light change again before following. By the time I crossed, she was farther ahead than before, her figure already blending into the crowd at the far end of the street. I considered turning off onto a different road. The thought came suddenly and urgently. But my feet kept moving forward, carrying me along the same route I always took. I told myself it didn't matter. That whatever that moment was, it was over. Still, the feeling lingered, a low-level unease that followed me block after block, like static under my skin. I saw her again near the park. The streetlights had just come on, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The park was dark, empty at that hour, the path inside barely visible beyond the iron fence. She was standing near the entrance, facing it, her tote bag now held tightly against her side. She hadn't noticed me yet. For a moment, I watched her from a distance, my steps slowing. She looked like she was gathering courage, or bracing herself for something. Then she turned her head. She looked back at me again, and this time there was something new in her expression. Relief, maybe. Or resignation. She didn't wait as long this time. She raised her eyebrows slightly, a barely perceptible gesture, like she was offering me the chance to stop her. The air felt heavy, charged. I became acutely aware of how alone the street was now, how the sounds of the city seemed muffled, distant. I opened my mouth to speak. No words came out. The moment stretched, and with it came a sudden, sharp understanding that scared me more than confusion ever could. It felt like she wasn't asking for directions or help or reassurance. It felt like she was asking for permission to continue being where she was. To step forward. To enter the dark space ahead of her. And somehow, without knowing why, I felt that my response would matter more than it should. I swallowed and nodded. She exhaled, a long, quiet breath I could almost hear from where I stood. Then she turned away from me and walked through the park gate, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. I stood there, frozen, watching the empty entrance. The streetlight flickered once, briefly dimming, and when it steadied, the path beyond the gate looked deeper than it should have been. I didn't follow her. I went home the long way, my thoughts looping uselessly, replaying the look in her eyes, the way her shoulders had dropped, the sense that I had agreed to something without understanding it. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing at the edge of that dark path, waiting, patient, like she had all the time in the world. Since then, I notice it more often. People who slow at corners. Who hesitate at doorways. Who glance back at me with that same quiet, questioning look. Most of the time, I look away. I pretend I don't see it. But every now and then, I catch myself nodding without thinking, and afterward, I feel that same cold weight settle in my chest. Because I don't know what happens to them when they turn away. And I don't know how many times I've already said yes. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was just my eyes adjusting to the dark. It was late, sometime after midnight, when the city loses its daytime shape and becomes something softer, more uncertain. I was walking home alone, the air cool and still, the streetlights humming faintly above me. I had taken this route countless times, knew every storefront and doorway by heart. That familiarity was the only reason I noticed when something felt slightly off. The building seemed closer. Not dramatically. Not enough that I could point to it and say something was wrong. Just enough that the space between them felt tighter than it should have been. I slowed my pace without meaning to, my footsteps echoing more than usual, and glanced up at the brick facades on either side of the street. They looked the same as always. Same windows. Same fire escapes. Same cracks in the walls. And yet, the street felt narrower, like it was holding its breath. I told myself it was perspective. Night does strange things to depth and distance. Shadows soften edges. Light bends around corners. I kept walking, hands in my pockets, trying not to focus on the feeling settling low in my chest. But with every few steps, the sensation returned, subtle and persistent, like a quiet pressure against my ribs. Halfway down the block, I stopped and looked back. The street behind me looked normal. Open. Spacious. The buildings stood where they always had, indifferent and still. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and turned forward again. That was when I felt it most clearly. The buildings ahead leaned inward, just slightly. Not enough to scrape the sky or touch each other. Just enough that the gap between them felt intentional. Like they were listening. I laughed quietly to myself, the sound thin and unconvincing. Exhaustion. I decided. Too many late nights. Too much time alone. I forced my legs to move, each step deliberate, grounding myself in the familiar rhythm of walking. The pavement felt solid beneath my shoes. The air smelled like damp concrete and distant rain. Everything was normal. Except it wasn't. As I walked, I became aware of how the sounds around me had changed. My footsteps seemed louder, bouncing off the walls and returning slower than they should have. Somewhere far away, a siren wailed, but it sounded muffled, like it was traveling through layers of fabric. Even the hum of the streetlights felt closer, lower, like it had dropped nearer to ear level. I glanced up again. The buildings hadn't moved, not in any way I could prove. But the space between them felt different now, charged with a quiet tension that made my shoulders tighten. Windows reflected the streetlights at odd angles, and for a moment, I had the uncomfortable impression that the reflections were watching me pass. I sped up. The street responded by feeling narrower. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. The change was gradual enough that my mind struggled to track it. The sidewalks felt closer to the center line. The walls seemed to loom just a bit more, their shadows stretching farther across the pavement. I told myself not to look up again, afraid that acknowledging it would make it worse. At the next intersection, I paused under a flickering light. The cross street looked normal, wide and open, with buildings set back comfortably from the road. Relief washed over me so fast it made my knees feel weak. I stepped forward, crossing into that space, and the pressure eased almost immediately. Behind me, the street I had just left looked the same as always. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, feeling foolish. Whatever I had imagined belonged to that block alone, to the way the light hit it at night. I shook my head and continued on, choosing a different route home. One with wider roads and newer buildings. For a while, everything felt fine. Then, slowly, the feeling returned. This street was wider, lined with modern buildings of glass and steel, set back farther from the road. There was no reason for it to feel cramped. And yet, as I walked, I sensed the same subtle shift. The reflections in the glass seemed closer. The distance between my shoulders and the walls felt reduced, even though I was walking straight down the center of the sidewalk. I stopped again, breathing shallowly. The buildings hadn't leaned. They were leaning. Not physically. Not in any way that could be measured. But perceptually, insistently, they pressed inward, their presence more pronounced than their shape. It felt like standing between two people who had leaned in during a conversation you weren't supposed to overhear. I became acutely aware of my own size. Of how small I was in comparison. Of how easily the space around me could change without my consent. The thought made my skin prickle, and I found myself walking faster again, my steps echoing unevenly now, as if the sound had less room to travel. No one else was around. That detail bothered me more than anything. This was a part of the city that was usually active even late at night. But the sidewalks were empty, the road devoid of cars. It felt like the world had narrowed its focus to just me and the space I occupied. The buildings leaned closer. Just enough that I had to fight the urge to press my arms against my sides. I reached my apartment block and stopped abruptly, standing under the entrance light. The pressure eased instantly. The street behind me looked normal again, wide and indifferent, the buildings upright and distant. I stood there for several minutes, staring, waiting for something to shift. Nothing did. I went inside and locked the door, leaning against it as my heart slowly calmed. I told myself I had imagined everything. That stress and fatigue had twisted my perception. The explanation felt fragile, but it was all I had. For a few days, I avoided walking at night. When I finally did again, I stayed on busy streets, surrounded by people and noise. Nothing happened. The buildings kept their distance. The city felt like itself. I relaxed, slowly, convincing myself the experience had been a one-time thing. Until I noticed something else. When I walked behind someone late at night, just one person ahead of me on an otherwise empty street, the buildings leaned again. Subtly. Patiently. As if waiting to see whether I would close the distance between us. I started keeping space between myself and others, slowing down or crossing the street when I found myself too close. The pressure would ease when I did, the city relaxing around me like it approved of the decision. Now, when I walk alone at night, I pay attention to the space around me. To how wide the street feels. To how much room the buildings allow. Some nights, everything stays still, upright, distant. Other nights, without warning, the walls seem closer than they should be. Just enough to notice. Just enough to make me wonder what would happen if I stopped walking altogether, and how close they would lean if I let them. I reached for my phone out of habit more than panic. It was late, close to 12:30 a.m., and I had taken a wrong turn somewhere near the edge of downtown. The night was cool and still, the kind where the air feels heavier the longer you stand in it. Streetlights cast pale pools of light on the pavement, and the buildings around me were quiet, their windows dark and unreadable. I stopped walking, slid my phone from my pocket, and told myself I just needed to check the map, already uneasy without fully knowing why. The screen lit up normally. No glitches. No cracks. My signal bars were full. That alone should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. I opened the map app and waited for the familiar grid of streets to appear, the blue dot pulsing gently where I stood. Instead, the screen stayed blank for a second longer than usual, a pale gray background stretching edge to edge, and I felt a small, sharp twist of discomfort in my chest. Then something loaded. It wasn't the city. There were no street names. No blocks. No landmarks. Just a smooth, empty shape where the city should have been, like a placeholder that never finished rendering. The blue dot was there, centered on the screen, but it floated in nothing. No roads beneath it. No context. I zoomed out, my fingers moving quickly, and the emptiness expanded with it, endless and uniform, offering no clues and no edges. I frowned and stopped zooming. The map didn't flicker or correct itself. It didn't try to load. It simply stayed that way, calm and blank, as if this was exactly what it was meant to show, and that calmness unsettled me more than an error message would have. I looked up from the phone to orient myself. The street around me looked real enough. Brick buildings. Metal fire escapes. A closed cafe on the corner with chairs stacked inside. I could hear a distant engine somewhere, the low hum of the city still alive beyond this block. I looked back down at the screen, expecting the map to snap into place now that I had given it time, and felt my throat tighten when nothing changed. I turned in a slow circle, holding the phone out in front of me like it might react to my movement. The blue dot shifted slightly as I rotated, responding to my compass, but the background remained empty. No matter which direction I faced, the phone refused to acknowledge anything beyond my exact position. And the realization made me feel strangely exposed. I tried switching apps. Weather loaded instantly. Messages opened without issue. I even opened my camera and pointed it at the street, watching the familiar scene appear on the screen exactly as it looked in front of me. When I closed the camera and returned to the map, the emptiness was still there, waiting. I told myself it had to be a temporary glitch. Bad data. A caching issue. Something mundane. But the explanation didn't sit right, because the phone wasn't behaving like something was wrong. It wasn't lagging. It wasn't searching. It wasn't failing. It was showing me something very deliberately, and I couldn't shake the sense that it expected me to accept it. I started walking again, slow at first, watching the blue dot move across nothing. Each step felt heavier than the last. I expected the map to catch up, for streets to fade in as I moved, but nothing appeared. The dot slid smoothly, tracing a path through blank space, and I became aware of how quiet the street had grown, the usual background noise thinning out until my footsteps sounded too loud. I stopped at an intersection and looked up. The cross street existed. I could see it clearly. The road stretched left and right, disappearing between buildings. I looked back down at my phone. The dot hovered in the same empty field, no indication that an intersection existed at all, and a cold unease settled into my stomach. I took a screenshot without thinking, wanting proof, wanting something solid to look at later. The image saved normally. When I opened it in my gallery, it showed the same thing, a single blue dot floating in featureless gray. Seeing it preserved like that made my pulse quicken, because it meant this wasn't just a momentary display error. It was something my phone believed was accurate. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket, suddenly uncomfortable holding it. For a few seconds, I stood there, listening. The air felt different now, thicker, as if sound didn't travel as far. Even the streetlights seemed dimmer, their glow less generous. I had the strange impression that the city around me was still there, but no longer fully participating. I walked faster, choosing a direction at random. My sense of distance felt off, like the block was longer than it should have been. When I reached what I thought was the next corner, I slowed, confused by how long it had taken. I checked the storefronts as I passed, reading signs I knew, touching brick I could feel under my fingers, grounding myself in details that felt increasingly fragile. I pulled my phone out again and reopened the map. Still nothing. The blue dot pulsed patiently, as if waiting for me to decide something. I zoomed all the way out, expecting at least the outline of the city, the river, anything to anchor me. The screen remained empty, stretching on without borders, and for the first time, I wondered whether the problem wasn't that the map couldn't find the city, but that it couldn't find me within it. That thought made me stop walking. I stood there, perfectly still, and watched the dot settle. It didn't drift. It didn't snap to a road. It simply existed, suspended in a space with no reference points. My breathing sounded loud in my ears, and I became acutely aware of how alone the street was now. No passing cars. No voices. Even the distant engine I'd heard earlier was gone. I tried calling someone. The call rang once, then went silent, not disconnected, just quiet. I ended it quickly, my hand trembling slightly. I didn't want to test what else the phone might do, or not do, if I pushed it too far. I looked around again, and that was when I noticed something else. The street signs were there, but I realized I hadn't read them in a while. Not consciously. I forced myself to look at the nearest one, focusing on the letters until they made sense. The name was familiar. Comfortingly so. I repeated it quietly to myself, grounding myself in language. When I looked back down at my phone, the map still showed nothing. I started to feel a subtle pressure, not physical, but mental, like the longer I stayed, the harder it became to remember exactly where I was in relation to anything else. The city around me felt increasingly self-contained, like a set built just far enough to function. I had the unsettling sense that if I walked too far, or stopped too long, the details might thin out even more. I decided to head home by memory alone. I put the phone away and chose the route I had walked hundreds of times, trusting muscle memory over technology. Each turn felt slightly wrong, but close enough that I could keep going. Still, I couldn't shake the urge to check the phone again, like part of me needed to see that empty map, needed to confirm it was still there. When I finally reached my building, relief washed over me so suddenly my knees felt weak. The entrance light was on. The door was exactly where it should be. I unlocked it and stepped inside, letting the familiar smells and sounds settle my nerves. Only once the door was locked behind me did I take the phone out again. Inside, the map loaded normally. Streets snapped into place. Names appeared. The blue dot sat neatly within the grid, exactly where it should have been. I stared at it for a long time, my reflection faintly visible on the glass. Everything looked right. Too right. Like nothing had ever been wrong at all. I went to bed eventually, telling myself the night had just played tricks on me, that fatigue had warped my perception. The explanation felt thin, but it was enough to let me close my eyes. Now, sometimes, when I'm out late and reach for my phone, I hesitate before opening the map. Because I'm afraid that one night, it won't show the city again. And that eventually, it won't even show me. I noticed her smile before I noticed her face. It happened late, close to 1 in the morning, when the streets had thinned to almost nothing and the air felt damp even though it hadn't rained. I was walking home again, taking the longer route on purpose, trying to convince myself that nothing about the city bothered me anymore, and that was when I saw the curve of her mouth under a flickering streetlight, waiting. She stood near the edge of the sidewalk, not blocking my way, not trying to be seen, just present in a way that felt deliberate. She wasn't close enough to startle me, but not far enough to ignore either, and that distance made my steps slow without my permission. I remember thinking that if she had been smiling at her phone, or at someone behind me, it wouldn't have mattered, but she wasn't looking anywhere else, and that made my chest feel tight. As I got closer, the details came into focus one at a time, like my mind was rationing how much of her it would allow me to see. Dark coat. Hands folded loosely in front of her. Hair pulled back, neat but unremarkable. Her face looked ordinary, forgettable even, except for the way her smile didn't change as I approached, and the longer it stayed the more it felt like it was waiting for something specific. I told myself she was just being polite. Maybe she recognized me from somewhere. Maybe she thought she knew me and was about to realize she didn't. That explanation should have softened the moment, but instead it made me uneasy in a deeper way, because her smile didn't have that tentative quality people have when they're unsure. It was steady. Certain. Patient. I passed her without stopping, my eyes forward, my shoulders tight. I felt her presence slide past me like a draft. Subtle but noticeable, and I expected the moment to end there. I took 3 steps, then 4, and waited for the normal relief that comes when something awkward is behind you. It didn't come, and that absence made my skin prickle. Against my better judgment, I glanced back. She hadn't moved. She was still standing exactly where she had been, still smiling, but now she was looking directly at my back, as if she could see through me. The streetlight above her flickered again, briefly dimming her features, and when it steadied, her smile seemed slightly different, not wider, not sharper, just more settled, like something had fallen into place. I turned forward again and kept walking, my pace faster now. My thoughts began looping, replaying the expression on her face, trying to understand why it bothered me so much. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't mocking. It felt almost relieved. The idea made my stomach turn, and I tried to shake it off. A block later, I told myself to forget about her. People smile for all kinds of reasons. The city was full of strangers with their own private thoughts. I focused on the rhythm of my steps, the faint hum of electricity from the streetlights, the distant sound of traffic somewhere far away. Normal details. Grounding details. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. At the next intersection, I stopped to cross and felt that familiar pressure again, the one I'd noticed on other nights. The buildings on either side of the street felt closer, not by much, but enough that I became aware of the space I occupied. I looked up at the windows, dark and reflective, and wondered briefly how I looked from above, alone in that narrow strip of light. When I crossed, I caught my reflection in a shop window and paused. My face looked tense, eyes slightly too wide, jaw set in a way I didn't recognize. I watched myself for a moment, breathing slowly, and that was when I realized something else. I was smiling. Not fully. Not obviously. But the corners of my mouth were lifted just enough to mirror the expression I had seen earlier, and the sight made my breath catch. I forced my face to relax, my skin feeling tight as I did, and the reflection returned to normal, though the discomfort lingered. I continued walking, more alert now, scanning doorways and corners without really meaning to. The street felt quieter than before, like sound was being absorbed instead of reflected. Even my footsteps seemed subdued, the echoes returning later than they should have. I had the uneasy thought that the city was paying attention to me again, and I didn't know why. Halfway down the block, I sensed someone behind me. I didn't hear footsteps. There was no shadow stretching toward mine. It was just a feeling, sudden and insistent, like a hand hovering an inch from my back. I slowed slightly, testing the sensation, and felt it slow with me. My heart began to pound, each beat loud in my ears. I stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard a soft exhale, close enough that I felt it against the back of my neck, warm and unmistakably human. I didn't turn around right away. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last, and waited for something to happen. Nothing did. When I finally turned, the street behind me was empty. No woman. No movement. Just the same quiet stretch of road I had walked moments before, looking innocent and unchanged. The streetlight flickered again, and I felt foolish, exposed, like I had reacted to something that existed only in my head. I told myself that fear does that. That it fills in gaps. That my mind was still replaying the earlier encounter and projecting it onto the dark. The explanation felt thin, but it was better than the alternative, and I held onto it as I walked on, my shoulders tense. I saw her again 2 nights later. This time, she was sitting on a low concrete wall near a bus stop, her posture relaxed, her hands resting on either side of her. I recognized her immediately, even before she looked up, and my heart sank with a familiarity that felt wrong. When her eyes met mine, that same smile appeared, unchanged, as if no time had passed at all. I slowed despite myself. She didn't speak. She didn't gesture. She just watched me approach, her expression open and calm, and as I drew closer, I felt a strange pull, not physical, but mental, like a question I was on the verge of answering. My thoughts began to quiet, the usual noise fading into the background, and that scared me more than panic would have. When I passed her, she turned her head to follow me, her gaze steady. I felt it on my back again, that awareness, and my steps faltered. I wanted to ask her what she wanted, who she was, why she kept appearing like this, but the words felt distant, unreachable, like they belonged to someone else. Behind me, I heard her stand. The sound was small, the scrape of fabric against concrete, but it echoed too long in the empty street. I waited for footsteps, for her to close the distance between us, but instead there was only silence. I turned slowly, my pulse racing, and found her standing where I had left her, still smiling, still watching. Something about the way she looked at me had changed. It wasn't her expression. It was her eyes. They held a recognition that made my throat tighten, like she was seeing something in me that I had only just begun to notice myself. The longer we looked at each other, the stronger that feeling became, a quiet pressure behind my eyes, urging me toward an understanding I didn't want. And then it hit me. The city felt calmer. The buildings no longer leaned. The street felt wider, more generous. The air seemed to move more freely. Sound traveling normally again. The tension I'd grown used to over the past weeks had eased without me noticing, and the realization made me feel hollow. She smiled a little more, just enough to acknowledge the shift. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It wasn't cruel. It was the smile someone gives when you finally grasp a simple truth they've been waiting for you to see. The thought made my stomach drop, because I didn't know what that truth was, only that some part of me had accepted it. I took a step back. Her smile didn't fade, but her eyes softened, like she understood my hesitation. She tilted her head slightly, the gesture subtle and almost kind, and I had the overwhelming urge to stay where I was, to let the moment finish whatever it had started. The urge scared me enough that I forced myself to turn away. I walked home without looking back. That night, I slept deeply, without dreams, the kind of sleep that feels like sinking. When I woke, the sense of unease I'd carried for so long was muted, distant, like a memory that no longer had sharp edges. For a few hours, I almost convinced myself that everything was over. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself smiling for no reason at all. And in those moments, I feel the city relax around me. As if it knows that I understand now. Or that I'm getting close. The night it happened, I noticed the quiet first. Not the normal late-night quiet, the kind that settles gently when traffic thins and people go to sleep, but a sharper silence that felt deliberate. I was halfway down a familiar street just after 1 a.m., the air cool and slightly damp, my breath faintly visible under the streetlights. I slowed without meaning to, because something about the soundscape felt wrong, like a song that had dropped a note. My footsteps stopped echoing. I paused, one foot slightly raised, waiting for the sound to catch up, for that soft slap of rubber on pavement to return from the walls around me. It didn't. The sound had been there my entire life, so constant I'd never thought about it, and its absence left a hollow space that made my chest tighten. I set my foot down carefully, listening, and still heard nothing. I told myself the shoes were worn. Or the pavement was softer here. Or the night air was doing something strange. The explanations felt flimsy, but I needed them, so I kept walking, my steps measured, my attention fixed on the space around me. The streetlights hummed faintly, but even that sound felt distant, stretched thin, like it was coming from farther away than it should. The buildings on either side stood perfectly still, their windows dark, their surfaces absorbing what little light there was. I became aware of how straight the street was, how far I could see down it without obstruction, and how empty it looked. No cars passed. No voices drifted from open windows. Even the usual background noise of the city felt muted, as if someone had turned it down just enough for me to notice. I stopped again, fully this time. The silence deepened. It wasn't just an absence of sound anymore. It felt active, focused, pressing gently against my ears. I swallowed and became aware of how loud that small movement was inside my own head. My breathing sounded exaggerated, each inhale and exhale too clear, too present, and I found myself trying to breathe more quietly, as if I didn't want to disturb something. That was when I had the unsettling thought that the street wasn't empty. It was attentive. I shook my head slightly, annoyed at myself. Fear does that, I reminded myself. It anthropomorphizes empty spaces, turns stillness into intention. My footsteps stopped echoing. I paused, one foot slightly raised, waiting for the sound to catch up, for that soft slap of rubber on pavement to return from the walls around me. It didn't. The sound had been there my entire life, so constant I'd never thought about it, and its absence left a hollow space that made my chest tighten. I set my foot down carefully, listening, and still heard nothing. I told myself the shoes were worn. Or the pavement was softer here. Or the night air was doing something strange. The explanations felt flimsy, but I needed them, so I kept walking, my steps measured, my attention fixed on the space around me. The streetlights hummed faintly, but even that sound felt distant, stretched thin, like it was coming from farther away than it should. The buildings on either side stood perfectly still, their windows dark, their surfaces absorbing what little light there was. I became aware of how straight the street was, how far I could see down it without obstruction, and how empty it looked. No cars passed. No voices drifted from open windows. Even the usual background noise of the city felt muted, as if someone had turned it down just enough for me to notice. I stopped again, fully this time. The silence deepened. It wasn't just an absence of sound anymore. It felt active, focused, pressing gently against my ears. I swallowed and became aware of how loud that small movement was inside my own head. My breathing sounded exaggerated, each inhale and exhale too clear, too present, and I found myself trying to breathe more quietly, as if I didn't want to disturb something. That was when I had the unsettling thought that the street wasn't empty. It was attentive. I shook my head slightly, annoyed at myself. Fear does that, I reminded myself. It anthropomorphizes empty spaces, turns stillness into intention. Then, faintly, I heard something else. Not a sound exactly. More like the impression of one. A subtle shift in the air, a pressure change that felt like the beginning of a response. I slowed, my pulse hammering, and the sensation grew clearer. It felt like when you pause in conversation and realize the other person is about to speak. The street was listening. The thought arrived fully formed, uninvited, and lodged itself in my mind. I didn't know what that meant or how it was possible, but my body reacted as if it were true. My shoulders tensed. My hands curled into fists. Every instinct told me to be careful, to choose my next action with intention. I whispered, "Hello," before I could stop myself. The word barely made it out of my mouth. It sounded thin, fragile, like it might break if handled too roughly. For a split second, nothing happened, and I felt a rush of embarrassed relief. Then the silence shifted. It wasn't louder. It wasn't broken. It changed shape, somehow, bending inward, focusing on me so completely that I felt exposed, like I'd stepped into a spotlight only I couldn't see. The pressure around my ears increased, and I had the overwhelming sense of being acknowledged. I took a step back. The feeling followed. I didn't speak again. I didn't trust my voice, didn't trust what might happen if I offered it more than a single word. I turned slowly, scanning the street behind me, half expecting to see someone standing there, listening alongside me. The road was empty, stretching back exactly as it should, and yet it felt just as attentive as the space in front of me. I stood there, caught between directions, and felt very small. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The sound was shockingly loud in the silence, jarring enough to make my ears ring. I fumbled for it, hands unsteady, and pulled it out, the screen lighting up my face. No notifications. No missed calls. Just the home screen, glowing too brightly in the dark. The moment the screen lit up, the pressure eased slightly, like the street had leaned back just a fraction. I let out a shaky breath and lowered the phone, afraid that even this small intrusion had been noticed. The silence settled again, not as intense as before, but still focused, still present. I realized then that the street wasn't reacting to sound alone. It was reacting to attention. The thought made my stomach twist. The more aware I became of it, the stronger the sensation grew. When my focus wandered, the pressure lessened. When I tuned back in, listening for it, feeling for it, the silence sharpened again, like a feedback loop. I forced myself to think of mundane things. Grocery lists. Emails I needed to send. The exact layout of my apartment. Slowly, the street seemed to relax, the silence loosening just enough that I could hear the faint hum of electricity again. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. I didn't stop walking after that. I kept my gaze forward, my thoughts deliberately unfocused, my pace steady. I avoided looking too closely at anything, avoided listening too hard. With each block, the normal sounds of the city crept back in, tentative at first, then stronger. A distant car passed. Somewhere, a door slammed. The world resumed its usual shape around me. By the time I reached my building, the street sounded normal again. Too normal. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, letting it close behind me, and only then did I realize how tense my body had been. My muscles ached as they relaxed, and I stood there in the dim lobby for a long moment, breathing. That night, I dreamed of standing in an empty place, surrounded by walls I couldn't see, speaking without sound and being heard anyway. I woke just before dawn with the impression of attention lingering, fading slowly as I moved and thought and filled the space with noise. Now, when I walk late at night, I pay close attention to sound. Not because I'm afraid of losing it, but because I'm afraid of what might happen if I notice it listening again. Sometimes, the street goes very quiet. And I make sure not to listen back.